Hatred is a thrilling emotion. Dear, I feel like I'm going to die because I detest you so much. Playing almost 100 roles during the 1940s and 1960s, Glenn Ford became Hollywood's golden face. He appeared in films with Rita Hayworth, B. Davis, and Marlon Brando, and in 1958, he was the world's largest star. However, if you focus only on his positive traits, you will never truly understand the man he was. Although he never married her, Glenn loved her till the day he passed away. It was nearly 50 years before he saw his son. But in order to prevent a nurse from placing a "do not resuscitate" order on his hospital bed, his son had to go in court. He had affairs with hundreds of well-known people and was married 4 times. He made well-known appearances in Blackboard Jungle, The Big Heat, and Gilda. However, he passed away quietly and alone in a hospital room. It seems like no one cared about Glenn Ford. No one would want him as a partner, husband, or father, even though he wasn't a nasty person. He was one of the saddest and most complex individuals in Hollywood history because of his internal conflicts and unfixable blunders. A hero who refrained from speaking until his kid recorded everything he said. On May 1, 1916, Glenn Ford was born in Portneuf, Canada. He was born with the lengthy full name Gillian Samuel Newton Ford. There was something different about the blood in his veins. His mother's side of the family was related to Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, while his father was related to Sir John Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. Since his birth, Glenn has been caught between 2 worlds, one founded on tradition and status, and the other on pursuing aspirations across national boundaries. In 1924, Glenn's family relocated from Canada to Santa Monica, California, when he was just 8 years old. The most significant decision of his life was this one. The Canadian boy had his stage debut in school plays there, under the dazzling sun off the Pacific coast. At Santa Monica High School, Glenn first experienced the allure of living in someone else's tale and changing who they were. He most likely learned how to conceal his own story at that point as well. After graduating in 1934, Glenn joined various theater organizations over the West Coast. Despite his lack of funds, he was able to work. When he wasn't playing, he patched up his family's house, worked as an electrician, learned how to be a carpenter, and worked in construction. Nobody anticipated that Hollywood would require Glenn Ford, not the real man, but the ideal man that people wished to believe in. But his conservative railroad boss father advised him to learn a trade in case Hollywood doesn't need you. In 1937, he tried out for 20th Century Fox but was rejected. A year later, he failed once more. But he didn't give up. Glenn Ford went from being well-known in a small Canadian community to becoming a Hollywood celebrity in the United States after Columbia Pictures. Glenn Ford agreed to a long-term contract with Columbia Pictures in 1939. The company's manager, Harry Kahn, made a bold but astute decision. As opposed to purchasing stars from foreign firms, as he had done in the past, Kahn decided to cultivate Columbia's own actors. They chose Glenn and another name, William Holden. His prediction was straightforward: one of them will make it, and the other will be eaten alive. He had no idea that they would become close friends and share fame. When Glenn landed his first major role in the film Heaven with a Barbed Wire Fence, it wasn't an easy one. Director Ricardo Cortez ridiculed him on the set, calling him a lousy actor and vowing never to collaborate with him again. Because of the long-standing animosity, Glenn nearly assaulted him when he spotted him at a diner years later. But everything may change with a single big Hollywood break. That moment for Glenn Ford arrived in 1946 when he and Rita Hayworth became renowned thanks to the film Gilda. In her era, Rita was a sex icon, and Glenn's gentle, silky manner was the ideal counterpoint. Although Rita received the majority of the attention, Glenn's performance left a lasting impression. They began a complex and unsettling friendship that would endure for 40 years with that film. Glenn's work truly took off after Gilda. He portrayed a noir detective in the 1953 film, The Big Heat, for which he received an Oscar nomination. Playing a teacher in a chaotic school alongside Sidney Poitier in 1955's Blackboard Jungle, he helped establish the genre of educational dramas. He co-starred with Marlon Brando in a satirical comedy in 1950's Excess, Tea House of the August Moon, and in 1957's 3:10 to Yuma and Cowboy. He demonstrated his proficiency in westerns by demonstrating his ability to shoot and ride horses. Glenn Ford rose to the top of the American film industry in 1958. For an actor like him, who always maintained a composed, understated appearance and never did anything ostentatious or controversial, this was a huge event. The 1960s saw the release of both bad and good films, but Glenn continued to play the same roles in Cimarron, 1960, Heaven with a Gun, 1969, The Rounders, 1965, and The Courtship of Eddie's Father, 1963. As his film career began to wane, he turned to television, where he was kept occupied throughout the 1970s by series including Once an Eagle, The Family HVAC, and Cad's County. He made a brief but poignant appearance as Superman's adopted father, Jonathan Kent, in Superman, the movie, 1978. This marked the end of his film career. Once more, Glenn's poise, firmness, and gentle kindness touched the crowd with a single glance. He avoided using large movements or intricate lines. Although he had a few cameos in his later years, such as in Day of the Assassin, 1979, everyone understood that Glenn Ford's prime was over. And before him were pictures of himself, his son, and the woman he loved, things he had yet to forgive. When the United States entered World War II, many celebrities chose to serve their country by selling war bonds or performing for the troops. Glenn Ford followed suit until he told the director of Destroyer, 1943, "I can't keep just playing a soldier." At that point, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. The decision rocked Hollywood. The head of Columbia Pictures, Harry Kahn, was furious. When Glenn chose to depart, he was making him the company's biggest star. He wasn't content to merely portray a soldier on television. He was determined to become one. He did not, however, have a complete heroic arc throughout his life. Glenn soon began experiencing serious health problems after being transferred to the Marine Corps' Public Relations Division. He spent 5 months in the hospital after doctors discovered that he had a duodenal ulcer, which was extremely painful. He was therefore unable to report for duty. It was a failure that he never discussed, which was disappointing for someone who truly wanted to demonstrate his abilities. Glenn Ford returned to his career in film after leaving the Army in 1944, but he never lost his pride in his service. He progressed to lieutenant commander while remaining in the Naval Reserve. After that, he was assigned to oversee military outreach and media. Nearly 50 years later, in 1992, Glenn received the French government's highest award, the Legion of Honor, for his assistance in escaping the Nazis during the war, not with a weapon, but with films, fundraising trips, and humanitarian endeavors that demonstrated his support for justice. Glenn Ford carried that soldier's code with him throughout his life, composed, accountable, and occasionally too alone to seek assistance. After the war, he might not have used a firearm in combat. Although he was a man who couldn't hold on to anyone in his personal life, the military viewed him as a dedicated soldier. People admired him because of his glow, but it also turned off loved ones. That was the beginning of another tragedy that harmed marriage, love, and the bond between a father and son, and that never truly improved. It was deeper, quieter, and more permanent than any battlefield. In the 1940 film The Lady in Question, featuring a stunning young lady, Glenn Ford made his film debut. Rita Hayworth was her name. At the time, neither of them was well known and they were both just beginning their careers. But their acting was only one aspect of their relationship. They had an innate chemistry, a cinematic electricity that lingered in the silence of the screen and sparked in their gaze. They had both matured as individuals and artists by the time they reconnected 6 years later in Gilda, 1946. Despite falling in love, they chose not to disclose their relationship's name. Gilda rose to fame. On one occasion, Glenn remarked, "I never saw Gilda as a movie, it was a memory." Rita, who was alone and renowned, found the quiet security she had always required in Glenn. However, the timing was not favorable for them. When Glenn was not with Rita, her spouse was Judson. When Rita was divorced, Glenn was already married to Ella Laner Powell. Following that, she married Prince Ali Khan and Orson Welles. They constantly managed to get back together despite their constant tardiness. Rita lived in Beverly Hills with her then-husband, screenwriter James Hill. Rita informed Glenn that the acreage next door was recently up for sale. Glenn made a snap decision. They purchased it and constructed a new home directly adjacent to Rita's back wall. The following day, after Glenn moved in, Rita filed for divorce. Despite the hush, everyone was aware of what was happening. Glenn installed a little gate on the back fence so Rita could enter at any moment without the media noticing. They lived in the heart of Hollywood as if they were secret lovers, ate breakfast together, and lounged in the sun by Glenn's pool. In 1972, Rita told the media, "Glenn is the best neighbor a woman could ask for." However, there was more to that smile than first appeared. They were to one another everything but never truly their own. Despite having numerous relationships in the years that followed, Glenn Ford never forgot Rita. He claimed that she appeared in some of his best films and that he was always devoted to her. Around 1981, Rita started to lose her memory. Her early onset Alzheimer's disease, according to the doctors, meant that she was gradually losing everything, including herself. She represented the vivacity and charm of Hollywood. Glenn stayed. He discreetly supported and cared for her in her final days. When Rita passed away in 1987 at the age of 68, Glenn was among those who walked carefully behind her body. Everyone could see that a silent ocean was rupturing inside of him, even though he didn't cry or say anything. What they did together during those 40 years was never known with certainty. They were never truly apart, despite the fact that they never married or lived together. Glenn once remarked, "A part of her will always live in me." In a movie about Rita Hayworth's life, it may have been the most heartbreaking and lovely love story Hollywood has ever concealed from viewers. Glenn Ford had a deep affection for Rita Hayworth, but they never got married. However, he never truly loved Ella Laner Powell, the lady he married. Glenn, then serving in the military, met Eleanor during a war bond fundraising party in 1943. At one point, Eleanor outperformed even her co-stars in MGM's lavish productions, making her the current tap dance queen of Hollywood. Her beauty, strength, and drive to assist others astounded Glenn. Within a year, they were married. He continued to live with his mother, while she did the same with hers. Following the wedding, they moved into a 22-room home in Beverly Hills. In addition to being a representation of Glenn's ascent from the working class, Ella Laner ended her artistic career there when she was 33 years old. When she was at the top of her career, she left the stage, the audience, and the accolades to marry Glenn Ford and have their only child, Peter, in 1945. Her devotion wasn't enough to keep Glenn grounded, even if he was at the height of his career at the time. While Ella Laner dedicated herself fully to their family, Glenn engaged in several extramarital romances. These included long-term romances with other women as well as brief relationships with co-stars on set. Although no one is certain, Peter Ford claims that his father recorded over 140 private conversations with a number of Hollywood celebrities, including Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, and Geraldine Brooks. Although there were no altercations or public outbursts, Eleanor was most upset by how silent and chilly their three-story home felt for an extended period of time without any apparent cause. Eleanor lived above, and Glenn lived on the first floor. Their son Peter resided with his grandmother, Hannah, in the center. The residence was inhabited by 3 persons, but none of them had any knowledge of the other 2. In 1959, when Peter was 14 years old, Ella Laner discreetly filed for divorce, ending 16 years of a marriage that wasn't truly a marriage. One day, Peter would recall, "My dad didn't hug me or talk to my mom. He just showed up when he had to and then disappeared." Glenn signed the documents without protest. The man she had sacrificed everything for had her heart, but she left her son behind. For the next 23 years, Ella Laner never married again and never loved anyone else. Making up for a love that happened at the wrong time with the wrong guy seemed to take up the rest of her life. She discreetly devoted her time and efforts to raising her son, working in the religious field, and philanthropy. She passed away in 1982 from cancer. Her ashes were interred in a plain brass casket at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Neither a large service nor media representation was present. Only the youngster she had referred to as the only reason to keep going was present. Glenn failed to attend the funeral. He might not have known how to handle it or had the time. Only one child was born under Glenn Ford's name, despite the fact that he had affairs with hundreds of women. Peter Newton Ford, that child, was raised in a household where his father was hardly present. In 1959, Ella Laner Powell sued for divorce and was granted custody. Glenn did not resist. Additionally, he didn't stay in touch with Peter during his childhood. Glenn was completely absent. He didn't contact, write, or offer assistance. My dad loved women, his work, and everything else save being a parent. Peter once said to the world, he was my biological father, but he wasn't there. In order to avoid being labeled reckless, Glenn sent a tiny monthly support check, but it was never enough to compensate for an empty childhood. Even though Peter portrayed heroic heroes and devoted fathers in films, he lived with his mother and grandmother in a home where the past never quite disappeared. The fact that Glenn and Peter frequently collaborated, particularly on the television series Cad's County in the 1970s, but were more like co-workers than buddies off set, was even worse. There were no embraces, meals, or joyful glances from a father to his child. Nobody was able to stop Glenn from becoming old after that. Following several strokes, he was unable to walk. He started to lose his memory. He was reliant on others for everything and had to use a wheelchair. During this period, he called Peter back. Not as a son, but rather as someone who needed his assistance. But there were no more floors now that everything was back under one roof. All that was present was a broken father and a child attempting to make sense of his life as bits of memory and medical equipment played in the background. Glenn began to reveal stories that no one else had heard, tales of long-kept secrets, unspoken fears, and a life full but never honest with the only person who called him Dad. For the first time, my father looked at me for a long time and then asked, "Do you remember when you were little?" That's when I knew he was trying to make things right, late but sincere, Peter later said in an interview. Following Glenn's passing, Peter wrote the autobiography Glenn Ford, A Life, 2011, not to place blame or exact revenge on his father, but to share the story that his father had chosen to keep hidden his entire life. This man used to be adored and admired by the world's most beautiful ladies, but in the end, all he could do was ask his son to write the two words he was unable to express himself, understood. The movie industry looked up to Glenn Ford when he was at the top of his game. However, he was not the same person that people knew in his later years. Warm, anchored smiles, vivid recollections, straight backs, and steady eyes will all be gone. After he approached 70, Glenn began to experience frequent strokes. His body stopped listening to him, his memory became hazy, and his neurological system deteriorated. They were all worse than the last one. He used to confidently cross movie sets, but now he was completely reliant on others and required a wheelchair. Glenn was no longer living with his son. Rather, he was living with Pauline Kernan, a considerably younger private nurse who had been employed as his full-time caregiver. However, things soon went odd. According to Peter Ford, Pauline was completely trusted by his father. Glenn had altered his will to exclude the majority of his possessions. Even though Glenn was still alive, talking, and obviously wanting to live, Peter became furious when he learned that Pauline had posted a "Do Not Resuscitate" (DNR) order outside of Glenn's hospital room. Peter had to go in court to defend his father's right to life, despite the fact that it had nothing to do with money. Following the conference, Pauline was no longer Glenn's medical proxy, the DNR order was revoked, and the terms of care were altered. It was more than just a legal matter. The final experience a son has with the specter of a parent who has been emotionally aloof all of his life. Glenn invited Peter and his family to move in with him after everything that had transpired. That's when he stopped being a poor parent, a gorgeous lover, or a movie star. He was merely an elderly guy, clinging to what little remained of the one embrace that had at last become available to him. For a few more years, Glenn lived in peace. It was his final performance, interview, or piece of writing. The Beverly Hills home where Peter had once lived, where he had laughed and fallen in love with Rita, was now deserted. At the end of the day, the only sounds were sighs that dissipated like fog, the gentle hum of a breathing machine, and the sound of wheels on tile. 4 p.m. The silent death of Glenn Ford occurred on August 30, 2006. He was 90 years old. Hollywood did not hold a lavish wake or farewell. However, he requested that Woodland Cemetery in Santa Monica be used to inter his ashes along with those of his cherished dog Bismar. He had always slept in bed with Bismar, a devoted dog. A serene, but not joyful, conclusion. Even though he would always be a prominent person, his entire life might have been a protracted quest for forgiveness from the women he loved, the child he abandoned, and the father he never truly reconciled with. There was never any fame for Glenn Ford. On TV, he didn't wave his arms or make large gestures. He didn't try to attract attention in real life. As a result, Glenn developed into the type of performer that audiences in America used to trust, identify with, and view as a reflection of themselves. He portrayed a police officer in The Big Heat, a Western farmer in Cowboy, and a father in Superman. In all the roles he played, he didn't do anything. He held them close, gave them a sense of security, and made them feel gently sad when he didn't succeed. He wasn't James Dean, Marlon Brando, or Clark Gable, but he was Glenn Ford, the guy everyone wanted to work with on set and believed to be real. It was once remarked that he was the ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances. Over the course of his more than 50-year career, Glenn Ford appeared in more than 100 films. These films included comedies, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, The Tea House of the August Moon, westerns, 310 to Yuma, The Fastest Gun Alive, Jubal, social dramas, Blackboard Jungle, The Doctor and the Girl, film noir, Gilda, The Big Heat, and even superhero films, Superman, the movie, 1978. In 1958, he was America's largest movie star, a position that few actors had maintained for longer than a year. He had it for 4. Unfortunately, hardly many people today can recall Glenn Ford. He didn't have a memorial after his death or a large statue on Hollywood Boulevard. Additionally, there are no revival attempts for his vintage films like there are for John Wayne or Humphrey Bogart. Peter Ford remarked within months of his passing, "My father was incredibly famous until he died." Perhaps this is because Glenn never sought to stir up problems. Unlike so many other famous people, he never experienced a scandal, a public breakdown, or a tragic conclusion. Like his life, Glenn Ford passed away softly, slowly, and without requesting recognition. And that quality is what makes him memorable. Because he left no rituals or sculptures behind. It permeates every scenario in which he simply existed without performing. A silent phrase, a yearning gaze, a man who was horribly, uncannily real but never flawless. Being famous was never Glenn Ford's goal. He didn't go on stage to impress, he didn't strive to get noticed, and he never utilized his suffering to draw attention to himself. But because of this, he became one of the hardest acts to forget. His life was filled of inconsistencies, as you can see if you steal a peek behind the scenes. He oscillated between light and shadow, between love and distance, between the guy his family never quite knew and the man the public loved. He was unable to marry the woman he had loved for 40 years. When the allotted time was almost gone, he returned after leaving his only child and begged for forgiveness. After a brief period of fame, he vanished without a trace. If you've ever seen Gilda, been moved by his gaze in The Big Heat, felt his presence in Blackboard Jungle, or felt secure seeing him as Superman's father, you've already touched a piece of Glenn Ford's legacy, even though Hollywood has forgotten his name and the films that made him famous are now in storage. It's not a legacy of medals or awards, but just the knowledge that a man like that, quiet, strong, and full of invisible scars, once existed. If you believe that those who remained loyal to themselves to the end, such as Glenn Ford, deserve to be recognized, appreciated, and honored, share this article. Have you and Glenn Ford ever seen a film together? What aspects of him do you recall? To ensure that his name is remembered, kindly leave a review. Additionally, remember to subscribe to our channel for more previously untold tales about your favorite legends.